All right, we are live. Good evening, everyone. My name is Seisha. I'm the social media manager at Charis Books and Charis Circle. And tonight we're so excited to welcome Mel Cassidy in conversation with Alex Iantaffi for a discussion of Radical Relating, a queer and polyamory-informed guide to love beyond the myth of monogamy, a provocative, trauma-informed guide to post-monogamy, how to build liberated relationships rooted in empowerment, equity, and authenticity. Tonight, Mel will be in conversation with Alex Iantaffi, who is the author of award-winning book Gender Trauma, amongst many other books that they have co-authored and edited. They're also a cultural worker, family therapist, WPATH certified gender specialist, AASECT certified sex therapist, somatic experiencing practitioner, clinical supervisor, and mentor. Alex hosts the podcast Gender Stories and the YouTube series Warm Take Wednesdays with Dr. Alex. It's my honor to introduce our guest of honor tonight, Mel Cassidy, who is a somatic relationship coach committed to the path of liberatory love and rewilding intimacy. They specialize in working with queer and questioning humans and those who love them, exploring post-monogamous relationships with a focus on polyamory, solo polyamory, and relationship anarchy. Before I head out and let y'all continue the conversation, I just wanted to remind folks that there's going to be a brief Q&A towards the end of the session. So if you have any questions, leave them in the chat, leave them in the Q&A tab, and Alex will be able to look through them towards the end. And of course, big reminder that buying your book from Charis allows us to keep putting on events like this. If you would like to directly support our work and buy Radical Relating at the same time, you can do so at that teal link right below all of us right now where it says Buy Radical Relating. Click that link, it'll take you to our website where you can purchase it from us. But I'm going to head out.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I appreciate you. Oh, what a pleasure to be here with you, Mel, and everybody who turned up. Apologies about the quality of my voice tonight. You get the sultry hoarse voice that you get when I'm in a flare. So thank you for bearing with that. Before we get started, and Mel reads from their fabulous book to begin with, we thought that we'll take a moment to just arrive. You know, we're both somatic practitioners, and so I don't know about you, but often we go from thing to thing to thing, especially online. And so if this is now your cup of tea, feel free to check your email, refill your water for the next couple of minutes, go to the bathroom if you're rushed here. But if you would like to join us, we're just going to spend a couple of moments just kind of getting in touch with ourselves first so that we can be more fully present to the conversation with each other. And of course, this is just an invitation. So just do what feels good and accessible and consensual in your own body mind at this moment. So I'm just going to invite you to pay attention to your breath. I know we're breathing all the time from our first breath to our last breath. That's the dance of our lungs. It's always happening, but we're not always intentionally focusing on our breath. And so if you want to, you can soften your gaze or close your eyes, but you don't have to. And we're just going to turn our attention inward for a few breaths. And this is just an opportunity to say hello to our body-mind right now and just see how we're doing. I'm going to invite you to really notice whatever is going on with as much curiosity and as much non-judgment as you're able. We're not trying to change anything. We're just slowing down for a few moments. As you breathe and slow down a little bit, if you could notice whether your muscles are tense, relaxed, or in between. Maybe there are places that might be hurting or be uncomfortable in your body, and that's okay. And if that's the case, maybe trying to find something that feels a little bit more spacious or a little bit more comfortable right now. That can be as small as one of your toes or your ear, whatever feels like comfortable and spacious in your body right now. And I'm just going to invite you to breathe into that comfort and that spaciousness for a couple of breaths, going at your own lung capacity. And again, just noticing what that feels like. When we slow down and we give ourselves a little moment to connect with a little bit more spaciousness in our body minds. And then I'm going to take a breath into my hope and wish that the conversation that we're about to have serves all of you and all who are touched by the way you relate with other people, whether it's for your work, your everyday life, the way you relate with yourself as well as with others. Knowing that we're held by all those who come before us who've done this hard work of radical relating, all the relationship liberation ancestors, relational justice ancestor, radical relating ancestors. And then coming back to this body mind, and if your eyes have been closed, maybe this is a good time to very softly, taking all the time you need, kind of gently open them again. Maybe starting to look around the space you're in, noticing colors and shapes and familiar noises and smells, or taking a sip of water or tea. Maybe even like stretching if your body needs to you know, get a little more comfortable, and maybe even just relax and, wherever you're sitting a little bit more, really feeling held by the chair, the couch, the bed, the floor underneath you. Here we are, about to have a conversation about radical relating. Welcome. So,
Thank
Mel, thank you. Are you going to start us off with reading from your beautiful book?
I will. I will. We were thinking about what part of the book to share as a reading, and I'm going to share something from one of the earlier chapters, which speaks about the role of feminism and the evolutions of non-monogamy in the modern day. And I'm also going to add in a little bit talking about systems of oppression. Through the influence of feminism and feminist values over the last 200 years, non monogamy has been reimagined. Feminism is a term that is often misunderstood. Some assume that it is solely about giving women the vote or granting women equal power to men. But at its core, feminism seeks to dismantle hierarchies by fostering anti oppressive, non hierarchical paradigms. Feminism today challenges systems that automatically privilege any group. The first wave of feminism in the 1800s was the age of suffrage and campaigning for women to have the vote, go to school, and take their place alongside men in the workplace. Relationships in the Western world began to be reimagined. If women were not property and could have agency, what would then become of relationships? Early experiments in non-monogamous community building, like the Oneida community, emerged. In 1914, Emma Goldman wrote the essay Marriage and Love, questioning romantic assumptions and challenging the social basis for marriage. The second wave of feminism in the West was an age of women's empowerment. Revolutions in birth control in the 1950s made the free love movement possible. Feminist writers like Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin deconstructed patriarchy, while Robert Heinlein explored the idea of multiple marriages through science fiction stories. The group marriage-based Charista commune,
who would go on to coin compersion to describe sympathetic joy, was formed. The 1980s and the advent of the AIDS crisis saw a shift in both feminism and non-monogamy and the heralding of a third wave. While intersectional feminism, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, highlighted the disparities between white women and women of color in the Western world, queer communities were fighting for gay rights and pushing back against the stigmas that HIV carried. This was also the era in which the term ethical non-monogamy first emerged, and in 1997, both Deborah Anapol's Polyamory, The New Love Without Limits, and Dossie Easton and Janet Hardy's The Ethical Slut were published. These books painted new possibilities for non-monogamy. It didn't have to be group marriages and communes. You could be autonomous and have ethically non-monogamous relationships with multiple consenting adults. In the early 2000s, the scope of feminism had grown to include dismantling all systems of oppression. Many Western countries have now legalized same-sex marriage. There is a broader sex education in schools and more legislation to support trans rights and much more. In 2006, Andy Nordgren published the Relationship Anarchy Manifesto in Europe. And in 2012, the Supreme Court of British Columbia recognized that consensual non-monogamy was not a violation of Canadian anti-bigamy laws. Responding to a need for consensual non-monogamy affirming therapy, numerous individuals have been inspired to pursue their counseling, psychotherapy, and psychology degrees with the non-monogamous client in mind. Social media and stronger interest from publishers means there is more support than ever for newcomers to non-monogamy. According to the Organization for Polyamory and Ethical Non-Monogamy, approximately 5% of the population in the United States currently practice some form of non-monogamy, and up to 6% of people would prefer non-monogamy over monogamy. Surveys in the UK suggest that 7% of the population have been involved in consensually non-monogamous relationships at some point in their lives, while a survey in Spain indicated that almost half the population agreed it was fine to have more than one loving relationship at a time. Now I'm going to skip a few sections. White supremacy culture in non-monogamy. As explored in Chapter 1, white supremacy culture is a toxic and violent system that permeates our modern world and says human worthiness is determined by the extent to which we are white, thin, able-bodied, and rich, and hold control over resources. It intersects with patriarchy and colonialism to attempt control over our sexuality, our intimacies, and our relationships. Even when we are working on moving away from mononormative and cis-heteronormative ways of being and relating, internalized white supremacy culture can show up in our non-monogamy. 3 common behaviors that you might experience in non-monogamous relationships that come from internalized white supremacy culture are avoidance of conflict, resource and power hoarding, and expectations of conformity. In white supremacy culture, those who hold power may feel entitled to comfort, and conflict, being something that disrupts comfort, isn't tolerated unless it's done politely and non-disruptively. As a result of equating agreeability and niceness to comfort and comfort to safety, anyone who does bring up conflict or differences, or even draws attention to harm or abuse, can be accused of being harmful or disruptive. It may seem paradoxical that within non-monogamous spaces there is a culture of avoiding conflict, since the more people you relate with, the harder it is to avoid conflict and difference. However, since white supremacy culture has taught us to avoid conflict, we may lack the skills to navigate conflict in healthy ways and wish to avoid it because our unfamiliarity makes it feel overwhelming and scary. In patriarchal forms of non-monogamy, Resource and power hoarding looks like accumulating many partners of the same gender who do not have other relationships, or only with their primary partner's sanction, for example, polygamy. In feminist polyamorous spaces, resource and power hoarding can manifest in overt relational hierarchy, such as primary partners being prioritized over secondaries, or sneakyarchy, covert hierarchy where, despite no primary secondary labeling, there is still some kind of pecking order that places less worthy partners as lower priorities. Sometimes this power hoarding shows up in social spaces as unwillingness to share positional power in organizing community, gatekeeping of knowledge, or making unilateral decisions on behalf of others without consulting them. The idea that there is one true way to be polyamorous, or a single ethical code that governs all non-monogamy, is deeply embedded with the internalized ideas of perfectionism that we get from white supremacy culture. Sometimes people hold on to the idea of a gold standard because they feel under pressure to justify their non-monogamy within a culture that prioritizes monogamy and glamorizes the nuclear family. This even shows up from time to time in the literature and social media created by advocates for non-monogamy. But this has consequences. Those who don't adhere to the expected way of doing non-monogamy may be bullied and socially ostracized by other non-monogamists. And if they've already been othered by monogamists, they may feel very isolated. As we explore in the following few chapters, stepping into the new territory of non-monogamy when all you've had role modeled is monogamy can feel daunting. There is so much more to think about and track, leaving some who try to explore it without support, feeling exhausted, tapped out, and craving the comparative simplicity of monogamy. Many of the structures you'll find me sharing in this book are ones I either learned and adapted or created from scratch in my moments of feeling exhausted in polyamorous relationships. They supported me in reframing how I was relating in a way that wasn't tied up within terminology or bound by hierarchical or egalitarian structures. Over the years, I've found that they've helped many others explore non-monogamy too.
Oh, thank you so much, Mel. It's always a pleasure to hear authors read from their books. And so thank you so much for reading from those sections. I have so many questions. I really look forward to the questions from participants as well. So if you're starting to think about questions, please start putting them in the chat, and please keep putting them in the chat as we keep talking, and I will weave them in our conversation, as well as having some dedicated question and answer time towards the end. I want to start from thinking about non-monogamy. And this paradox, I think about it as a paradox, right? In some ways, non-monogamy is radical because we live in a very kind of dominant monogamous paradigm culturally, at least on Turtle Island in the so-called North America. I mean, I live in the so-called United States, you live in the so-called Canada, and so kind of that's why I'm talking about North America. But at the same time, non-monogamy is not inherently radical as well. It's not enough to be non-monogamous to be radical, in my experience. As somebody who has been non-monogamous for over a quarter of a century at this point, as you were reading about the history of feminism, I was like, oh, I remember that book coming out. Well, I remember that. I remember when we were all like, oh, relationship anarchy. Yes, that's a thing. That's a name we didn't have for what we were trying to do without language. And so I want to start maybe from talking a little bit about that paradox, right? Just like feminism can still be imbued with white supremacy, that we know about, white feminism and all the complicated issues there. And we'll definitely go there in relation to non-monogamy in a moment. But let's start from the kind of this broader idea that, yes, while non-monogamy can be seen as a form of radical relating, is not in itself necessarily radical, depending on how we practice it, right, in relation to systems of power, privilege, and oppression. How's that landing for you when I talk about that? Because I see you nodding. I know you have thoughts. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with someone a week ago about, is polyamory political?
Yes.
And I think that's like, that to me, that's like the most provocative essay title. Is polyamory
Right.
political? Because I think for some people it's not. Um, and and I hate that. I don't like that because I feel like it should be. And
Mhm.
I think the politics of it are that by saying no to the rules of monogamy, we are challenging not just the structure around relationships and family, but we're also pulling on this thread of all of these systems that are woven in together. And Professor Kim Tallbear talks about this in a
Mhm.
lot of her podcasts and writing about how the imposition of monogamy was part of the mechanizations or the mechanisms of colonialism. And all these cultures that were colonized, all of our cultures that were colonized, um, have histories of different forms of non-monogamy until European colonialism came along and said, we're not going to even listen to you unless you're having monogamous relationships. So in compulsory monogamy
Mhm.
is inherently political because it was used as a tool of political control. And so to reject that is also political. Now, there are people who will say, I'm doing polyamory, but I'm not giving up my socially
Absolutely.
visible nuclear family. I'm still going to have my marriage. Nobody's going to know what else I'm doing. I'm going to be very closeted about my other partners. And sometimes that's what people need to do. It's not always safe to be
Mhm.
out in all the ways
Absolutely. Mhm.
differ from society, and especially with what we're seeing in these times, it is certainly not always safe. Um,
Mhm.
but I think when people can hide themselves within the status quo, like there's a certain level of privilege there, right? And
Absolutely.
and um, and I think in that privilege, there's also a kind of complacency, and that's where I see the internalized mononormativity, what I call the monogamy hangover, continues to play out. So even though people are attempting polyamorous relationships, they might be doing it with monogamous scripting in place. And that's where all sorts of problems happen.
Absolutely. Oh my God. I have so many thoughts about how that causes so many issues, especially as somebody who loves reality TV, and now there are reality TV shows that kind of show people going on this like non-monogamous journey from lots of different perspectives. And I'm always kind of talking to the TV and going, no, not like that. Hang on a minute. You're applying monogamous standards. And I think it's interesting in relation to feminism as well, right? Because I think sometimes what I'm noticing or what I witness, whether it's in my work as a relationship therapist, or whether when I'm watching reality TV or in community, is that sometimes kind of a feminist approach to non-monogamy is very much seen as like women, leading or making the decisions, or sometimes even having veto powers, right? That's seen as kind of women empowerment and inherently feminist. And often there's a lot of kind of sneaky monogamy, patriarchal values, and just flipping the script is not inherently kind of approaching non-monogamy from a feminist perspective. So in your view, go for it. You had a thought. Jump for it.
Yeah,
Jump with
I
it.
learned this when I was living in rural BC. And I found through living in rural BC that people's understanding of feminism was not the same. And this is why it was useful for me to break down the different waves, because there's a different set of values that inspires each wave to emerge, right? And circumstances, like being present to what it
Absolutely.
is. And I think that's the wave of feminism that we're in now is very much present to also global climate change, also the poly crisis, like how do we also our collective liberation. And I think there are some people who do polyamory from a first wave feminism perspective. And I think there are some people who do polyamory from a third wave feminism perspective. And so this is something I've learned in my own life, is like when someone says they're polyamorous and they're a feminist, I'm immediately going in with curiosity about what kind of feminism are you practicing? Like, what does feminism mean to you? Where does this go? And someone very, very dear to me in my life, who I absolutely adore, I gave them a copy of the book, and they started reading this passage, and they were like, whoa, like I hadn't thought about it in this way before. And they are someone who really prides themselves on feminism, and they had never considered the collective liberation aspect of feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And so we ended up having a whole conversation about how that collective liberation piece plays into the practice of polyamory. And where I see that happen, is I think that also weaves in with like the values of relationship anarchy around, like, I'm not creating a default hierarchy. The collective liberation is, I'm not free till we are all free. We're engaged in consensus decision making. We're looking after the collective well-being of everyone. So even though we want to have our own individuality and our own sense of self, which I think is so foundational and important for any kind of healthy relationship, whether it's monogamous or polyamorous or something else, we also want to be able to connect relationally, empathetically with the well-being of everybody else. And there's an inherent complexity in that. And I think that when we can practice how to do that in our interpersonal relationships, I think it helps us to be able to do that more in all the other kinds of relationships we have in the world.
Absolutely. And I love what you said there, because it's like and I love what you said about approaching somebody with curiosity, right? Because just because somebody's approaching non-monogamy from a feminist perspective doesn't mean that we're coming to an understanding of what feminism is that is the same, right? I remember, this was many years ago, like 20 years ago. So it's been a minute. And I was in a situation where I engaged with somebody casually because they told me they were also non-monogamous. And then their wife was like, how could you? We're not in right relationship. And I was like, what is even happening right now, right? Yeah. And that turns out...
The old, I'm polyamorous, you're polyamorous, we should just date. It sounds like it would work out great. Yeah.
Yeah, it was even more casual than that, quite frankly. And I was self-fem presenting at the time, and I got this whole like, you should know that you cannot trust a man speech, right? And I was like, okay, it sounds like you have some issues in your marriage, and I respect that, but that's not on me. Like, but that's the other piece. I remember, even as somebody who's also been a feminist for a long time, going always, even before I transitioned, going, okay, feminism is not just like flipping the script. It's like, I think it's Stanley and Weiss in the UK, and I don't remember exactly in which book. It will come to me eventually. But they talk about, if we're taking seriously the phrase, the personal is political, which I do from feminism, right? It means that everybody's experience matters in their own words, even... This is a quote, so forgive me, people in the audience, but even enough heterosexual men, right, in air quote. And so that moment reminded me of this, right? And often I think that in non-monogamy, we can still play out all this gender dynamics, right? All this racialized dynamics, like you said, like white supremacy can still very much infiltrate the way we do non-monogamy in all those ways that you mentioned, like the avoidance of conflict, the resources and power hoarding, right? The expectations of conformity, right? This is how we do it, like the compulsory compersion sometimes, right? We talked about it when we talked about somatic compersion. Mm-hmm. And so I think that kind of keeping that curiosity, but also kind of keeping this kind of critical questioning attitude to non-monogamy is really healthy, because also the non-monogamy community has really kind of grown and evolved. Like we didn't used to, even using the term ethical non-monogamy is in itself problematic. I want to talk about that. I mean, I know you do
I
in the
love
book.
that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and so much of what you're describing, it also encapsulates my own experiences when I started exploring polyamory in earnest. Like, and I share this story in the book. Like, I had always had a sense of being attracted to multiple people and going, what do I do with that? And it wasn't until, I was married and we tried and like, no, we wanted with very different things. And when I actually started to explore in earnest and started meeting all these other polyamorous people, I felt confusion. I felt a lot of confusion that there seemed to be this like one right way to do it, but there was opposing ideas about what this one right way to do it was. And I didn't want to subscribe to any of those ideas. I was like, I don't want a primary partner. I just got out of a 7-year primary partnership. I don't really want that right now. I want to explore myself. And so I was like, I'm going to be my own primary partner. And there was no language for solo polyamory at that time. So I described myself as being single-ish. And I'm like, I'm in a primary relationship with myself. I'm having an orgy with the universe, and we're going to see what happens. And I would also run into people having a lot of judgments of each other that were based on this internalized sense of there's one right way. And that's where I find like the ethical piece is challenging. I understand why that came about. When we look at the ethical slut, it was written at a time where people were really pushing back and being like, oh, if you're queer, if you're gay, if you're non-monogamous, like that's inherently bad or dirty, right? And so they were saying, no, we're doing this ethically, and here's our code of ethics, so to speak. But what I find is, as our collective understanding grows, ethics are culturally subjective. And for me as a third culture kid, I was born in one culture. I was raised in another. I live in a third culture. I have been strongly influenced by several other cultures in my life. I'm a second generation third culture kid, so it just gets more and more complicated. And I know that every culture has a different set of ethics around what is permissible within the realm of non-monogamy. There is a time in human history where non-monogamy was considered ethical if you were a landowner and male, and you had your official wife, and you could have an official courtesan or, an official mistress. That was considered the ethical way to do it, right? And who are we to say that the way we're doing it now is the only right way? And so, to be culturally sensitive, I think let's not bring the word ethical into it. Let's actually just define what we're doing in our non-monogamy. And what it boils down to for me is everyone happy? Is everyone engaged, mutually consenting? Does everybody feel they have agency in what's happening around them and what their experience is? Are we doing this with kindness and compassion to each other? And those are so much more interesting to explore, because if we think about this lens of being kind and compassionate, even when someone's doing something that we're like, that hurts me, that sucks, I don't like that you're seeing this person or doing this thing, how can we engage with that in a way that is kind? Right? We don't have to be boundaryless to be kind. We can be very
absolutely.
Right? But to me, that's so crucial, because there's already so much complexity when you start having multi-partner relationships. Let's make it easier for ourselves. And the kind of triangulation that I've experienced it myself, and I've seen it come up for so many clients now, the kind of triangulation that can come up within poly situations that is rooted in, mononormative behaviors around like ownership and you must be beholden to me because we're married, or all these narratives. So much of that can be shifted when we step out of this sense of like there's one right way and go, okay, what's the kindest path forward here and now? If we're present to the here and now, what is the kindest way forward for us? in a way that everyone's honored, in a way that we look to supporting everybody, getting their core needs met, reaching their desires, manifesting their dreams, all of that goodness. And that requires more, I think, more nuanced relational skills than we get empowered with in general. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that often when people think about non-monogamy, sometimes what I notice is that there is a getting caught up in the rules, right? In air quotes, which to me is another hangover really of white supremacy, right? So people might say that they're ethically non-monogamous, but here, right? And here are the rules, right? Or let's have a contract, or let's have and no, I think agreements are really important. I think clarity and transparency and strong relational skills are really important. But sometimes I think people really get caught up in the structure, the rules, the contracts, right? All of those things. When I actually think that what's more important to have conversation around is the values, the beliefs, the intentions, like, right? How do we want to engage with each other? What do we have the capacity to engage with each other with, right? And I think that what's interesting then is that whatever we call the container becomes less and less important, at least for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like some of my partners are like romantic partners. Other people, I would say, maybe the world sees as friends. They're really part of my intimacy circle much more than some other kind of romantic or sexual partners, right? But I think people really get caught up on how to do non-monogamy, right? And there's a lot of content on how to do it. But actually, I wish that we could see more conversations around, what does it mean? Why am I engaging in non-monogamy? And how do I want to engage in non-monogamy? And I think that's what I love about your book, which, by the way, has a beautiful cover and beautiful art inside. Is that even if somebody's non-monogamous, I think they could get a lot out of reading this book. Because really, it's not just about non-monogamy. It's about intentional relating. It's about, not taking the politics out of relating, because how could we? It's about intentionality. It is about values, right? And I think that whether people are non-monogamous or monogamous, they could really benefit from some of the ideas in the book. How's that landing for you, this idea?
Well, they say never read the comments, and I've been reading the comments,
Of course.
reading the reviews on my book, and I saw one that made me smile, because they were like, "This book is all about like changing your mindset, but it doesn't tell you how to do polyamory." It was like,
sorry.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many books out there on non-monogamy now, which is wonderful. It's great.
Yeah.
No shade on any of the other literature, but a
Absolutely.
lot of the time, what it boils down to is an author saying, "This is what worked for me." And if you are similar to that author, if you are similar in your gender experience, or your social experience, or your racial experience, you're probably going to get so much out of that. You're probably going to find a lot of parallels. What I wanted to create was something that wasn't just going to work for people who were misfits like me, but also a framework through which we can understand. Because what I'm really passionate about is empowering people. And I feel like if we're constantly having to look to some other source to tell us what we're supposed to do, to tell us the rules, we're not empowered. We're infantilized, right? And that's part of the systems we live in, the power over and under. That's that patriarchal paradigm. And so the feminist and anarchist in me is like, I want to create something that is like a map. Like, this is teaching you how to navigate. Oh, this is what I'm experiencing right now. Here's what I can do to navigate. Here's what I can do to like reflect for myself. So that's why throughout the book, there's all these somatic pauses and the relational toolkit pieces, so you can actually practice them with your partner. I'm not telling you like, here's how to have the conversation about opening up your relationship, because there's so many other books that do that. I'm here helping you figure out, why is it that I want an open relationship? Is that actually what I want? What is the part of my relational ecology that is yearning for more connection? And what capacity do I actually have there? And what is the capacity of my partner to support me going there? Or how do I recognize the capacity of my potential partners? That's what I'm more curious about, which I think is it's a different layer of exploring. And that's why I call it radical relating, because radical, it comes from roots, right? I wanted to go to like right down to the roots of what is it to be in relationship. And I do hope that people who are monogamous read this, because I think there's a lot of people who explore polyamory because they're dissatisfied with monogamy,
Yes.
and then they're like, "What is this? It's not working." Polyamory isn't for everybody, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of relational skills that I think polyamorous folks have gotten really good at figuring out and honing, and that I think can translate over into the monogamous experience really well.
Oh, absolutely. And in some ways, you get to practice some of those skills over and over as a non-monogamous person in a way that you really can't within a monogamous framework. And so it's not so much as one better or worse. You just get to do relationships a lot more. Multiple relationships are more complex from a system point of view. And I agree that those skills, I think, are for everybody, not just for non-monogamous people. And the other thing that people often get caught up in is this idea of what is natural, in air quote, right? It's like non-monogamy versus non-monogamy is more natural, right? In air quote, or unnatural. It's more natural for men than for women. Then we get into all that biological gender essentialism, really, that it's not adult feminist, I don't think, actually. And so that's why I think why I love your book so much is because it really moves us away from some of those conversations and more into, let's really look at you know, like you said, the different waves of feminism and how they might impact the way we look at non-monogamy, our relationship to power, privilege, and systems of oppression, our relationship to white supremacy, and how that steps into everything, and how that shapes that relationship. And I think that when we do that, we also go through a transformative process where there can also be grief, right? Because it's the grief of maybe all the times I've crossed my own self-consent, right, to fit into a mold that dominant culture told me to, or maybe it's the grief of all this internalized kind of monogamist supremacy culture, or maybe it is the grief to realize how much white supremacy has played a role into your kind of non-monogamy journey. So, and I know you've got a workshop coming up on December 7th about grief and non-monogamy. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the role of grief as people go through this transformative journey of non-monogamy sometimes. For some people, it is a transformative journey. I think it was for me. So it still is in many ways. Mm-hmm.
I think there's a level of grief that's natural because, when you're stepping out of a monogamous paradigm into a polyamorous world, there is a grieving process around the dreams and hopes of monogamy. I think we're told that monogamy is going to keep us safe and secure and stable, till death do you part. That is not the reality of it for everybody, right? We look at divorce statistics and that'll tell you it's not the reality for everybody. But there's still a grieving process. And I think there's a very unique grieving process for people who open up an existing relationship. And there's also a very unique process for people who are solo going into polyamorous relationships. In terms of we're letting go of the mythology of soulmates, and we're having to find new ways to create and resource safety and stability and security in our lives. And what I think, when we don't have a relationship to that grief, the grief has power over us. And where I often see that come up is in bargaining and denial, right? Like we push away the things that are inconvenient for us to look at. Like, I'm not falling in love with this person. No, I'm not developing feelings. It's unrealistic. We're human beings. We are feeling beings. We're going to develop feelings. And so, that can bring up stuff. And I think the bargaining as well, when I see people in polyamorous relationships, almost kind of battling over the power, right? There's a lot of back and forth that can happen in there. So yeah, I mean, I have so much more I could say about grief and non-monogamy, and folks can go look at my social media because I'm posting a lot about that topic in the run up to this workshop on December 7th.
I've actually been loving all your posts, and it's given me a lot of moments of self-reflection in my own relationship journey, and yeah, I just find the way you think about non-monogamy, even as somebody who has been engaging in non-monogamy for a long time, really engaging, and really always opens up new things and new questions and new areas to explore, which is such a gift. And I could talk with you forever, as you well know, but I'm interested in seeing what questions there are from folks who are still here listening to us go back and forth about non-monogamy and feminism and white supremacy and grief. And so I'm really curious, and I'm hoping that maybe people are throwing some questions in there. Oh, yes, I found the little Q&A. There's a few questions.
So I can speak to this first question that's put in here, and
You
I
want to
just
read it, or do you want me to read it in case not everybody can see it?
well, it's a very long one, so
It is a very long one.
I want to offer a summary. I want to thank you, person who wrote this, for outlining what is a very complex set of dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And let me see if I can quickly find it. I like to create maps just to help things be a little
Mm-hmm.
easier. So there's a map in the book of these complex kinds of dynamics that I think can help you understand, like, which relationships are we actually dealing with here. But this scenario is kind of asking, like, I think, if I'm understanding it correctly, about what if desires don't match up with
Yes.
capacity or agreements that have been made previously.
Mm-hmm.
And so the framework that I offer in the book is that of a landscape of relationships. And this landscape has different quadrants: emotional, social, practical, and erotic. And you can have a relationship that exists in all of these quadrants. And you can have a relationship that exists in only one of these quadrants and never crosses into the others. And you can have a relationship that's very shallow in one and deep in another. Yeah, thank you. This beautiful art from Joan Trin Pham, from the book, that looks at the four quadrants. And so I think the radical solution there is to go, where is there capacity in the landscape for a relationship to form in a way that feels good for everybody involved? Yeah. And
Yeah.
the second question is there a category or label for people who deeply love each other, can't be romantic partners in the traditional sense, but need to honor and express the intense love and connection they have? Depending on what the expression of that looks like, maybe it's platonic partnership, maybe it's soul kin. I mean, we get to create our own terminology, if find the way that works for you to label it.
Absolutely. I do love that there was so much content in that question, because it also made me think about mixed orientation relationship. Because, right, if somebody's monogamous and falls in love with somebody who's polyamorous or a non-monogamous person, right, what happens? And I would consider that a mixed orientation relationship potentially. And that can work. Like, one of my nesting partners is essentially fairly monogamous, and was definitely monogamous at the beginning, and we are still together after 25 years. So I think that mixed relational orientations can work. There's another, but obviously it takes a lot of conversation and work. There's another question, and about being involved with somebody who is bi in polyamory. And I'm not sure if there's like more detail about that, but just kind of the role of sexuality in polyamory, maybe including bisexuality in polyamory. And if I didn't understand your question correctly, please feel free to correct me in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think I talk a lot about queerness in the book, and there's a
Yes.
whole chapter dedicated to the relationship between queerness and anarchy. And I mean, I identify as bisexual. So, like, if there's a, like, here's what worked for me, here's what worked for me as a bisexual person. And I think that, yeah, like, in terms of like navigating polyamory as someone who's bi, I mean, having attraction to multiple genders is, I think, a classic motivation for exploring polyamory and exploring non-monogamy in general. And again, I would go back to that landscape model to consider, like, what are you wanting from that? For some people, their bisexuality is a lot more about the erotic connection and not as much about the emotional connection. And for some people, it's the other way around. No, they really want the emotional partnership and not so much the sexual partnership. Maybe their sexual satisfaction is with different gendered sexual experiences. And so again, that's where that framework allows us to kind of go, okay, this is what feels like I actually want. Like, yeah, this is where this relationship might fit in this wider landscape for me. Yeah.
And there's kind of another question that it's really about, it's close to my heart as somebody who is a parent and has brought up their children in a polyamorous household is, do you cover discussing children who are impacted or even children who may feel non-monogamous leaning themselves, or identity or relational orientation, whatever we want to call it?
Yeah. I think if you really want to go down the rabbit holes on the research, you need to look at the work of Elizabeth Sheff. Dr. Eli Sheff has done an amazing amount of research on the children of polyamorous families. And I think, she's the gold standard on all of that information. What I do talk about in the book is the role of attachment. And the role that attachment, has played in our human evolution. We didn't evolve in the nuclear family. And yet attachment theory tries to reinforce the nuclear family as this ideal circumstance in which to raise children. But the way we evolved, and the way you can see it still in pre-colonial cultures or in cultures that have resisted colonization, is that children are raised by the collective. Whether that collective is polyamorous or not doesn't really matter. The children are raised by the collective. And children who are raised by the collective tend to have a lot more of a sense of secure attachment in themselves. They're not leaning on a single attachment figure. They have more emotional maturity as a result of having had more adults around them. And so I do talk about this role of attachment. And I think that for many people who are drawn to non-monogamy, there is an aspect of we're looking for not our single secure attachment partnership. We're looking for having a network of resilient attachment, right? We're looking to create that weaving, that web, that holding of there's multiple attachment figures in my life, that even when one isn't available, I'm held. I feel supported. That it's a bigger tapestry than one single person.
Absolutely. All those questions are so great. Somebody else says, as a seasoned non-monogamous relator, how can your book help us navigate the constant change that comes along with all relationship, especially long-term relationships where needs, feelings, desires are always in flux? These conversations and decisions are so ongoing and never final. So what's in your book that can help seasoned non-monogamous relators navigate those changes?
Yeah. So there's a whole chapter devoted to courageous conversations and navigating conflict. And I define conflict as like any difference between desires and wants and values. And so along with that, as you learn how to navigate conflict, you're also supporting your nervous system to be in conflict. We look at this idea of conflict intimacy, that we can actually grow closer through the journey of conflict. I also have a whole chapter on looking at agreements and how we come to a space of mutuality. So really, this is examining the consensual part of consensual non-monogamy and what does that mean to come together. And I like to break it down in terms of agreements of, we have implicit and explicit agreements. But within the explicit agreements, we also have there's agreements that make sense at the beginning of a relationship. They're like appetizers, hey, let's get our STI testings done every so many months. Let's check in about before things escalate with other people, right? They're your basic things. Then you get into your entree agreements, which is as you've gone longer in a relationship, it's okay, here it is. Here's the thing that we're doing. Here's the main course.
Mhm.
And then you're going to have seasoning agreements, which is like as you go along, you're like, this needs a bit more salt. This needs a bit more pepper. This needs some cumin, right? Like we add in the spices, and then you have dessert agreements, and dessert agreements about how are you going to navigate when a transition naturally comes. And this is the thing that this comes in from the monogamy hangover. Things are not permanent. What is now is not always going to be. That's where you need that network of secure attachment, because there's always change. We look in the landscape around us, there is always going to be change. And so having for me at least, and I've seen this supporting my clients, when we have a framework for how to think about these different stages of agreements, when we're in that space of going, well, okay, there's change happening, our needs and feelings and desires are in flux. Is this a situation where we just need a little more seasoning? Or do we need to figure out a new main course? Or is this a place where we need to move on to dessert and we need to figure out, like, how are we transplanting this relationship into a different part of the landscape? I hope
Absolutely.
it made sense.
It did to me, and I have to say, as somebody, for example, one of my nesting partnership has been very long term. The type of intimacies we moved in and out of have changed, and do change, for lots of different reasons. And so, you made sense to me, and I love what you said. I want to honor that there's a couple more questions I think we can get to before kind of wrapping up for today. There's one that, again, is pretty close to my heart as somebody who's both neurodivergent and polyamorous. Somebody said, I'm polyamorous, queer, neurodivergent. The vast majority of people in my circles are all three of those things. I've read that there is a strong correlation between being neurodivergent, specifically autistic, and being queer, mostly because of the autistic trait of questioning arbitrary rules, structures, and guidelines around everything, including gender and sexuality. Do you believe there's a similar connection between neurodivergence and polyamory?
Absolutely. Yeah. And as someone who is also neurodivergent, I'm part of that Venn diagram that is a circle. I think you might like the chapter I have on queerness and anarchy. And I don't specifically name neurodivergence in there because I don't think I'm enough of an expert in that beyond my own experience. But yeah, that what this person has mentioned around like the autistic trait of questioning arbitrary rules, I think that also plays into the anarchism piece of we are questioning the status quo. I think autism, as I experience it, really enjoys having form and structure, but isn't going to just go along with anybody else's form and structure, right? We want to know the why. I am certainly that kid who's always asking, but why, but why, but why, but why? And so that is the questioning of the powers, the patriarchy, the white supremacy. Like, again, we come back to that tapestry where all these things are woven together. You pull on one thread, you're eventually going to unravel the whole tapestry of, colonialism and late stage capitalism and compulsory heteronormativity and whatever neurotypical means, and like all of these things are woven in together, right? And whatever thread you start pulling on is the thread you start pulling on, and eventually you will pull on all of it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all queer autistic people are non-monogamous, but I do think it means that we get to reimagine what does it look like if we're not treating monogamy as the default. If we're not saying this is the prescribed way to do it, we're giving more agency. And what I hope my book does is empower people to have that agency, to make conscious choices around how they're going to build and grow their relationships.
That's a perfect segue to the last question. If people can bear with us for a few more minutes, which somebody kindly moved from the chat to the Q&A section. Can you speak on incorporating parts of the monogamous experience / monogamous culture in a healthy, in air quote, way? How to take positive parts of that and make your own blend of monogamish relating?
Yeah, I think a lot of that still lies in the deconstructing of that monogamy hangover and the the accepted normatives around how we do relationships. And so, where that starts with is getting in touch with yourself. I think there's a lot around the compulsory monogamy model, and certainly the nuclear family and the way attachment theory is taught and all of that encourages us to disconnect from ourselves, right? We're taught that being self-sacrificing is a love language, and we should be doing that all the time, right? And so to step away from that self-sacrificing and go, how do I deeply honor myself? How do I stay true to myself? How do I stay connected to myself without the cost of disconnecting from others to do so, right? How do I stay connected to myself and connected to others? And how do I not hoard that attention and affection? Because, what makes that compulsory monogamy unhealthy very often, and this also plays into polyamory too, it's the same problems, is when we try to hoard and possess. And when we learn how to, resource share our affection, and this is where the landscape model comes in useful, because it doesn't have to be erotic. It doesn't have to be sexual. It could be creative. It could be emotional. It could be practical. It can be in terms of like the way we socially bond with each other. There are so many other ways that you can explore queering the way that you relate. Yeah. Absolutely. I hope that helps answer that question for this person.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for all your beautiful questions. I believe we are at time, but especially after the last few things you said, I know that at the end of your book, there is this beautiful prayer for radicals, and that we were thinking about closing with reading this very brief prayer for radicals, which is at the end of your wonderful book. So take it away, Mel.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you for asking such great questions, everybody here. And thank you, Alex, for hosting this lovely conversation in between us, and to Charis Books too. I just want to invite everyone to notice what's happening in your system after listening. We get to talk about these big topics, and they have some charge to them. And so just inviting you to come back to that sense of spaciousness in yourself, wherever you can access that right now. And notice if there is in that spaciousness curiosity or hope or any other feeling. And this is the prayer for the radicals. May we grow and sustain loving, kind, and compassionate relationships. May we orient to safety and connection through growing relational ecologies. May our ways of loving be embodied and liberatory. May we know resilience as softness and the nourishing of somatic capacity. May we come back to ourselves as we resolve and heal relational wounds. May our desires to expand intimacy dissolve the differences that impede our ability to resist oppression. May we survive and thrive together. And may our search for liberated love include liberation for all.
Thank you so much, Mel, for writing this beautiful book and for spending time with all of us today. And thank you to Charis Bookstore for hosting this beautiful gathering online. And for all the people who showed up and all the people who are going to watch the recording, I'll pass it back on to Sasha now.
Thank you both. That was such an incredible and interesting conversation. Thank you both for being here tonight. Thank you to our audience for asking such insightful questions. I know it sucks to be the person that cuts a conversation off, but our evening has come to an end. I want to give everyone the opportunity to give some love to our authors in the chat. I think everyone is walking away with a little bit of wisdom and clarity and questions that can hopefully be answered in Radical Relating tonight. If you would like to purchase Radical Relating, support us and Mel at the same time and keep putting on, so we can keep putting on events like this, you can do so by clicking that teal button right below us where it says Buy Radical Relating from Charis Books and More. But yeah, that is all from us tonight. Thank you everyone for coming, and have an incredible rest of your evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. Bye everyone.